Okay, so here we're speaking about the video interviews. You had done the radio interviews and then the written interviews. I think at this point you had gotten a good hold of yourself as an interviewer, if not fully formed in the written interviews, simply because some of the guests did not correlate well with the form. But at this point, the video interviews, well, we have spoken off camera that the interviews themselves are not at the high point that they were at the very best of the written interviews. They're way more consistent. Even the worst of them have their moments and their merits.
Yeah.
The first interview with Alex Sharamet has vestiges of the old written interviews, some of the questions that parallax.
Yeah.
You decided, I think, to do away with most of that and just ask simple, concise little questions that and then have a lighter hand as a host. Talk a little bit about Alex's interview. I think one of the most notable moments is where he talks about books being like little ants, and also he is very good at keeping on topic, but also being able to expand outward from that.
I don't think he was talking about books as ants. I think he was talking about the artists.
The poets who write the books and how the books and the poets are viewed are kind of like ants and ant ideas. They don't even seem human, and they don't have anything expansive besides their ant-like impulses.
Yeah. That interview was the longest interview, I think, until I did the three the cosmology interviews. And then I think I think it's now the third or fourth longest interview. I think I've had two or three interviews that have gone a little bit longer than the 2.5 hours. If I could go back and redo it, I would probably, let's see, it's in two parts. And this, initially, I couldn't go past 2 hours with YouTube. And then I had a thing a little bit later on where I was doing a film noir show. And even though I hadn't done the interview yet, this asshole company from Germany then made a fucking bullshit copyright claim on a film that was listed even on YouTube as being, and another person had uploaded it as being on YouTube and being in the public domain. And so that's why I created, well, I was going to create E-Cosmoetica, the educational channel, which these appear on, these interviews with you, because of that. And so for about 34 of the interviews, I had to go back and put them on E-Cosmoetica first. And so that's why I still have 30 or something interviews there. And then I got to be able to do 2 hours and 10 minutes. And now I think I've had 2.5 hour interviews that I don't have to break up. And so I may have up to 3 hours now on YouTube. I'm not certain. But Alex's one, I'm showing here with part 1 and part 2. Let's see. Was an hour 25, so it's 2 hours, about 2.5, a little over 2.5 hours. If I was going to do it again, I probably would have reined him in a bit more and probably gotten it under 2 hours, because there are times when I think he goes off a little bit, he repeats himself, and it has a little bit of dead air. But this was the first interview that I did, and it was about almost 2 months until I did the second interview. It was the biggest gap between interviews then, too.
You've since also gotten better at punctuating everything with ums and ahs and whatnot.
You think I'm better? Seriously?
Slightly better. You still use whatnot as a frequent punctuation device, but the ums and ahs are not as bad. It's still very very raw in your speech. You're not like Charlie Rose or David Susskind, who can speak very loquaciously, or at least Charlie Rose could.
Well, it's interesting because I've gotten actually, maybe over 100 emails by this point, and I'd say it's probably 90 to 10% that people like that in the interviews, which really surprised me, because I do find it sometimes annoying myself, even though a number of my guests do it. It's just part of as I've aged, my natural speaking persona. And I think it's probably something that's New York based, because growing up, I remembered old men who would sit around in their Bermuda shorts would do that, and it may be just my inner New York coming out. But regardless, I probably would have.
Scientifically, it's supposed to also be a device used to move to the next natural idea. So it's a very common thing. I don't think it's just simply New York based.
Well, I do it because too. I sometimes have three or four things that go on in my mind, and I have to like throw two of them to the side, and then so. Uh, but yeah, Alex's interview is an excellent interview. Like I said, I probably now would be a bit more controlling and try to cut it down a little bit and not let him go on. But I was going through the format and whatnot. Initially, uh, I also would send out syllabi to the people. I don't do that as much now. I do. I do. I know the format that I'm doing so well, and I know enough about the topics that I'm speaking on that I don't need to do that unless someone asks me. There's this fellow that I was just emailing yesterday to do a show about the multiverse. This guy who's in Europe, a young kid who wrote a book about it, and he was very anal and whatnot. And I'm like, yes, we can do it this way. I said, relax. I said, I've got this. I've done this. I'm not an idiot. I know how to interview. You're not, I know how to ask the right questions if you're stuck on something. Um, and so I've gotten better as an interviewer, aside from the uhing and the umming. But Alex's one, like I said, would probably be closer to 2 hours if I did it again.
It's a good thing too, also to mention that your way of dealing with him is a little different because of your relationship with him. You know that you can push him on certain things,
Yeah.
and he won't all of a sudden blow up.
Yeah.
Whereas with the other ones, it seems like you're at the beginning you're kind of feeling them out for how they are as a person, and then you're just going with it afterwards.
Well, yeah, and the second interview is a good example of Vic Mignogna, the guy. He's a voice actor who did these.
Why is this one lacking visual? By the way,
A number of people. I got him on Skype, and I said, well, "Can you turn in your visual?" He said, "No, I don't want to do a visual interview." So what am I supposed to do? So I had to do it just an audio interview. There are a few people that have done that. And there's a woman that I've been trying to interview since the written interview days that doesn't want to appear, even though she's an actress, she doesn't want to appear on camera. But Vic Mignogna is a good example. I think I might have mentioned this to you, or I might have mentioned it somewhere else. He had he had some negative things that he didn't like about some of his competitors in the fan fiction Star Trek field, and he had said some things, and so I had him he wanted to re-record one of his answers, so I put that through. But other than that, it was a good interview. But you learn to people. I'm not here to try to embarrass someone. If he had felt embarrassed about something he had said about some of these other fan fiction productions, I don't want to cause him tension, so it doesn't matter. This isn't like I'm interviewing, Dwight Eisenhower about D-Day, and I'm going to say, General Eisenhower, you said that the invasion was launched 45 minutes late because you were fucking your secretary that morning and you didn't give the order. Something like that is historically important, as absurd as it is. Whether a voice actor who doesn't want some animus that he has for other people in the fan fiction field, that's not that important. So I'm not, I did that easily.
His Star Trek show is, and I have not seen the cartoon that you have mentioned in a Dan Schneider video. It is, even though it suffers a little bit by its short length, it is the best version of Star Trek outside of the original show that I've seen.
And that's why
I
said
it also has some episodes that are as good or better than anything in the original series.
Yeah.
I still put that one episode from The Next Generation, The Inner Light, as the best Star Trek thing I have seen. Period. But that show is so inconsistent, and its first few years are such shit.
One of his competitors, he directed an episode that was the best episode that series had, that he had directed. He does a very good young Shatner. He, without looking too much like Shatner and without being the Spock, doing that over the top kind of thing. And I've seen the two episodes that he's put out since he did that interview, and they're very good too. So I mean, I think that's quite good. I was using at the time. I was using this camera, this system called Super Tintin, and then I did that for the first 11, 12 shows. I think it was when I did the interview with Sarah Hostat and her friend, the musicians, that it kept when Skype hiccups. This system I'm using called Lightcam will go over, and once it resyncs again, the sound, the audio, and the video will sync up again, and it will capture that. It didn't do that with Super Tintin. I tried another system called Avaya. So I think it's for the first 28 or no, maybe about the first 20, 25 shows. I was using this inferior system, which is why you'll see a lot of the shows where it'll be desynced. And I was also recording the interviews on my desktop, which is an old desktop. That's why you'd hear a lot of time. You'd get that sort of stammering, which was caused by the system. That's why I'm recording this, and I recorded the last 60 or 70 plus interviews on my laptop because it's a newer system. It doesn't have as much crap or what on it. So anyway, so those are the first two interviews. The Lauren Isley interview I thought was the first really. That's probably still one of my favorite interviews, talking about the prisoner. And, oh, not I'm sorry, that's the Lauren Isley one. The prisoner won a couple of. Yeah, the prisoner won a couple of ones later. Was also a very fun interview to do. People who are passionate, and both the Isley people and the McGowan people are greatly passionate about their stuff. So they were very fun to interview.
Lauren Isley is the best English prosist probably published in the 20th century. But this also changes the format a bit. It uses interstitial readings that Jessica read and places them alongside the segments. Talk about that format. I know that you've gotten a little bit of shit over using public domain stuff because YouTube, and if you've followed any news stories about YouTube, YouTube is notorious for not following proper public domain laws. And this is a good intro to Lauren Isley. I still think that the essays that you wrote about him are more cogent to his work, and it is another one of these artistic interviews that speaks a little too much about his life and not enough about his art. I do think that they are full of passion, though, and it really comes off. And they're also very good memorizers of his passages, and they can reference certain things. I think artists will kind of just use his stuff as fodder, and then it kind of just intuitively coalesces in the brain. But since these fellows are experts on him and perhaps only him, they're able to recall exact passages and make cogent points about him. And I'm not sure, but did you get into the exact reason for his neglect and whatnot? Because I don't recall if that aspect was raised.
I don't think so, but you can't expect much in terms of the writing stuff from these people. Tom Lynch, I think he's a scientist or a professor who teaches science. Bing Chen isn't even.
Yeah, Dan. Before you go on, Tom Lynch, I recall one moment where you're speaking about how you've discovered great Nebraska writers, and you use Wilton Keyes, James Emanuel, and Lauren Isley as examples.
Yeah, and he brings
up this. I can't even remember what the
name of it. Ted Kooser.
Yes, Ted Kooser, right? The almighty Ted Kooser as a poet, as an example of another great Nebraskan writer.
Yeah, and I didn't say anything there because, but Bing Chen, I think, is a doctor, a medical doctor, so he's the head of the society, and in a sense, they're sort of fanboys of Isley, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. It's good to have that. As far as the public domain stuff, YouTube is notorious about that. I remember I wanted to interview this guy who has a site called, it's one of these like Bigfoot sites, video sites or whatnot. He had something taken down. There's a few other sites that do movie reviews that had some stuff taken down. It's like the problem with YouTube is that they have this stuff up there. This German company, I said to YouTube that they immediately give you a strike or something, which is ridiculous because you have to be, in our society, you're guilty until proven innocent. These people, I said, let them show me where they own the rights to this, because in America, where I'm from, this is public domain. If you want to block my usage of these clips in Germany because they own the right, that's fine. But and I since discovered that I could have gone against these people, and it would have taken 30 or so days to win the battle or whatnot. But I didn't have the time or the energy. There's so much other stuff that I have to do. So that's why I just let the thing wipe out after 6 months or something. But it's terrible. Google is one of the richest companies in the world. They more than enough. They have music sensors that can hear a musical piece and detect that you're using a copyrighted piece of music, which I don't even talk about musical copyright. Happy Birthday was written over 100 years ago, and it just recently fell into public domain when filmmakers sued to use it. I mean, it's ridiculous. Copyright is so abused. It's utterly ridiculous. Life of the author plus 20, 25 years maybe, or the life of the spouse. Forget kids or grandkids benefiting from something. The public good outweighs that. But you have apparently there are companies like this German company that go around making these false claims simply to screw with people. It's basically trolling. So after the film Noir Show, I said, I'm not going to use anything, even if it's obvious public domain stuff, because I don't have the time to waste. So it's just the interviews. Here in the Lauren Isley Show, I did get specific permission from the Lauren Isley Society to use a little clip from a public broadcasting thing that one of the people in the society granted me the right to use it definitively. So
it would help to actually be able to access that. It just shows you what a mess public domain is in, because some of the film interviews and some of the film shows and some of the more visual mediums would benefit from examples that you could speak about, whereas the way that it is now, you wouldn't ever be able to go on that kind of tangent. So let's move on to the next.
Just so you know, you live in Canada. You
Yes.
have, I think it's Life of the Author plus 70 years in Canada.
Yes.
It's Life of the Author plus 90 in the U.S. So you get a 20-year thing. But it goes against
that may change, though, because of a deal that they're making uniting 12 nations in this damnable system.
Well, whatever. But I mean, it goes against what copyright is for. Copyright is to protect the interests of the author. When the author is dead, dead people don't have any interest. So I'm even saying that I'll be nice enough to give 20 to 25 years for the heirs to make profit over the life of the author, or for the spouse. But quite frankly, I don't even think that's really fair. But anyway.
So the next interview is Gilles Brevel.
Gilles Brevel.
Gilles Brevel?
Yeah.
He's a fantastic painter, very good sculptor as well. His most interesting moment is when he's talking about his youth. I noticed that some of the moments that are kind of tangential in these interviews are some of the better moments too. It's not just specifically on the topic. Sometimes they're not as eloquent talking about the specific subject as they are these natural asides that people will make. But speak about how you discovered Gilles Brevel, as well as what you think of his art.
I think Jessica and I were in a town called Wimberley. I think I first saw his stuff in a town, Wimberley. That's one of these little Texas towns that's about 20, 30 miles outside of Austin that has, it's known as an artsy getaway. There's a town called Salado, Fredericksburg, a few others that have these kinds of reputations in Central Texas in the hill country. So I looked him up. He had a website. I said, do you want to be interviewed? He was interviewed. It's about an hour, a little less than an hour. The one thing I do remember is the thing that I used for the icon for the video was apparently a painting that he did, or one of the paintings there that I used was apparently a painting of his ex-wife, and he didn't want to use that, but he didn't tell me that until after it was up, and I was like, well, do you really want me to? I mean, it's your work. It could be based on your wife, but it's your work. It shows off your stuff. And then he never emailed me back after that, so I guess he was satisfied. He didn't force me to recut it, but it was just kind of silly. But I mean, he makes a few good points. It's again these first 10 or 12 interviews. I'm sort of wetting my feet, and finding the best ones in the first 10 or 12, I think, are the Lauren Isley and the McGowan interviews.
Yes. He speaks about his youth, art, and some of the business side of things. What do you think of him as a painter, though? I think that he is quite a good figurist, and he also is putting surrealism as a purpose to art rather than simply as a gimmick.
Yeah, I wouldn't put him on a.
His sculptures, I do find a little bit lesser as compared to his paintings.
Yeah, let me speak. I wouldn't put him on a league with Jiwei too. In 100 years, I don't think he's on a league with Jiwei too. In a sense, he's sort of like a lesser iteration of Dali with a few
Yes.
modern things put in. So I wouldn't put him as a great painter, but I think he's a very good painter. I think he's got a few paintings you could argue is great. He's
Yes.
someone that I would put, in a league as someone a near great painter. On a
Yes.
scale of 1 to 100, he's in the low 90s. I'd put. That's not to say that he couldn't have a late streak that rallies and he does a sequence of 20 or 25 paintings that are great that you could say, okay, well, he got great at the end. But right now, I wouldn't put him in a league with Jiwei 2. If you compare the bulk of Jiwei 2's paintings, Jiwei 2's are more classical, but they're deeper, they're richer. There's a deeper probe in little things, whereas Dali and surrealism are big flourishes. Dali has that thing that's described in what's his face's Schlein's book as dealing with mechanisms that have to deal with the physical universe and properties that Gilles Brevel's doesn't. Gilles Brevel's flourishes, the things that separate him, are things that are generally based upon his perception of the thing at the time, rather than a deep underwriting idea.
He is Dali light, and
Yeah.
if one were
But in
to
a good sense.
Yes, in a good sense, he is a very good Dali light painter. But if anything is light anything, then it automatically makes it, even in a very good sense, near great and subservient to the influence.
Yeah.
The next interview is on Patrick McGowan. I want to make a posit before we get into that. I think Patrick McGowan is arguably the greatest actor of the 20th century. I think that he has been given much neglect in that aspect, but he is the only actor I can recall in all the films I've seen of his and in The Prisoner that I don't recognize, and it's not because of the makeup. It's this because he has such an intensity to him and so much range that he's able to convincingly portray someone like that. I can think of that Alcatraz movie where he's almost unrecognizable. Even shit like Braveheart, he makes it a little bit better by his presence. Where as The Prisoner is probably the best thing he was in. Well, not just probably, definitely the best thing he was in, and also the deepest thing he was in. And it also shows the integrity of the man and how smart he was that he was able to conceive of such a show that played with the whole Danger Man trope, but going completely beyond it.
Have you seen Danger Man?
I've seen segments of Danger Man, but it's so much longer than The Prisoner that it would be impractical at that time, and I don't think that they're on YouTube as they were before now.
Yeah, if you get a chance, you can probably get the whole DVD set for $25 or something. If for Christmas you want to treat yourself, it's one of the best, if not the best, of the spy shows of the '60s, and it started actually in 1959. The half-hour shows, and I think we talk about a few of the episodes in this interview. The half-hour shows are just even better, I think, than most of the hour shows. Although he sustains them. There are a few differences here and there. The guys who I'm speaking with are involved with this society called Six of One, which is six of one, half a dozen of another, which is one of the tropes and the sayings that are used over and over again within the diegetic universe of The Prisoner. I don't know if I would say McGowan was the greatest actor of the 20th century. I would certainly put him in the top 10. I mean, I would put people. There were some Japanese actors in some of the great things. Marcello Mastroianni, even though he did some stinkers in the 70s
Well,
and 80s.
it is very arguable. There are many contenders, but I think when you look at the consistency of McGowan's work and the fact that he could make such shit into passability, at least in the moment it was in there, I think that raised him above. And Mastroianni, while he was great in his early work and even in his middle career, he descended in his later career, like all great actors do. But McGowan was someone who, even in his later days, was able to bring something. He's great in so many different roles. De Niro at his height is probably a better actor and had more range and had probably the most range of any actor, period. But he has sold out so much in the last 20, 25 years
Yeah.
that it is impossible to rank him above Nguyen at this point.
Yeah, I mean, again, these I would put him in the top 10. He's certainly one of the great. Te- te- he's probably in the top 2 or 3 television wise. I would certainly put him in the top 10 overall. I never saw him on a stage or doing a stage production, so I can't say. The two guys, though, were very interesting. They worked so well, and these two guys were sort of like Laurel and Hardy. They knew what the other one was going to say.
Yes.
They almost had like they could have gone on an act. They could do like a performance art show, the life of McGowan, and the two of them could just raconteur. We talk of everything from uh, the guys. At one of the guys says at one point, "I met Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden, the '80s rock band, who did a couple of songs based on The Prisoner." So it's very interesting. These guys went to a lady's apartment. It was postponed for about a month. I was originally going to do it, I think, in December of 2014. I didn't do it until January of 2015 because one of them got ill. And but yeah, they're just terrific together, and they work as a team so well. It was a fun interview. It was the best of the interviews I think up to that point.
The Prisoner show, the penultimate episode, is the best sustained amount of television I've ever seen. Has some of the best acting I've ever seen on a television show, and it's more closer to cinema than it is regular TV. I know you've written many times about The Prisoner, but in the context of his legacy, do you think that it will hold up to the standards? There are moments in the Twilight Zone that have similar highs, but the Twilight Zone is so scattershot and hit and miss that I think it's really indisputable. The Prisoner is the superior show.
Well, yeah, Prison only has 17 episodes, 180 episodes, so 10 times as many episodes for the Twilight Zone. And even if you just consider them as half-hour episodes, most of them, you still have probably about 90 to 100 hours of that show versus just 17 of The Prisoner. Um, probably the probably the least episode you could argue is maybe the girl who, the girl in death episode.
Or the one where a different actor plays McGowan.
Yeah, that one too. The Western episode also. That was in the first episode. The first season was I think 12 or 13 episodes, and the last 4 or 5 episodes were season 2 to wrap up the show. I'm glad that they didn't do that much more. I'm glad that they didn't have the total cop out that ends Nowhere Man, which is the closest I think that television has come to something like that. I would love to have interviewed McGowan. One of these days, I hope to interview Bruce Greenwood about his whole career because he's done some interesting things, but especially about Nowhere Man, which is the closest television series to The Prisoner. But yeah, so.
The next interview is on Watchmen.
Yeah.
This was on the E-list and has had correspondence and interactions with you for years. And another fellow, I don't remember his name, but he really rackets down the interview. This is probably the least of all the interviews up to this point.
Yeah.
The debate is silly and on a silly topic, and you raise one point of the ending Watchmen. And I have not read Watchmen, so I cannot refer to that, but I have seen the abominable film, and the ending to it is one of those endings that you just think, what the fuck, and what relevance does this have to anything? It's such a out of nowhere terrible ending that it completely, even if it was a sterling film before that, it would still racket it down to mediocrity. Yet this idiot goes on to defend it, and even Jason Sanford, I think, is making too many pluses for it when it is indisputably a terrible, horrid ending, one of the worst endings I've seen in any medium. And one of the silliest moments is when you're speaking of Citizen Kane, and that Jason Sanford goes on to say that, well, since Citizen Kane didn't really live up to the premise of the greatest film of all time, he doesn't really understand that. So even though he was part of the UPG, I see a completely different perspective from him. He's far more subjectivist
Oh yeah.
than objectivist.
Well, I know Jessica has often gotten frustrated when in arguments about art. Jason is someone who has been trying to get in academia, and then he gave up writing fiction, what do you call literary fiction, and to do sci-fi. He's much better in the interview I do standalone with him, and the interview I do with the comic book guy 20 some interviews later is much better than this one.
Yes, definitely.
But it was a topic that had come to me, and I was like, okay, let me ask about this, and there's really not much more to say about it, I don't think.
Yeah, but I think Jason by himself would have actually been better than the other fellow in there, because he doesn't really add much, and his defenses are so weak and mannered and artificial that it can do nothing but do a disservice to the interview.
And it's one of the things that the guy who's arguing it comes across as juvenile, and not that he's nasty or anything, but he comes across as he's just not as deep. But it's one of those things I can't really know until I get someone. Some people can sometimes say outrageous things in print, and they turn out to be a good interview because they're loquacious. There are some interviews I did later on, like the guy with Oswald Spengler. He seems a bit like, in the emails that I had with him, he seemed like a bit wacky, but he gave a magnificent interview. So you never know.
Amazingly, we will find someone who is worse than this fellow, and not just worse, but far worse. We'll get to that in a moment. Michael Jason Allen was the next. I have not seen any of his films as of yet, so cannot speak about them, but he seems like someone with potential. I've seen a few clips of his films. It's amazing how visually arresting some of them are, despite the lowness of the budget. And you made a good aside to him to watch Falstaff Chimes at Midnight on how to take such a low budget and raise it to great art.
Yeah, Michael Jason Allen is, I guess, in his early 40s, so I don't know how much better he can get. But his film, the film that came after this, was actually a better film than the one that I interviewed him about. Yeah,
shows you the magic of medicine.
Yeah,
and he's 40 because he looks like he's in his 20s.
Yeah, and he did a good job with it, and this was, I think, the first time he'd ever been interviewed. I remember he was very nervous. You could tell he's very nervous in the interview, but he comes off as a personable guy, and I did an interview just a couple of months ago with a young girl who's got some talent too. She's probably got a higher ceiling because of her youth than he does, if she keeps going. But yeah, to do an interview on something like that's one of the things I want to do. I've done reviews, for example, of self-published books, and there are some self-published writers that are better than the crap that's put out by academia. And so it's good to have someone like him come along. So
then there's Nick Longrich,
and he's the science guy. Yeah.
There's a long debate between him and Jack Horner where they speak about.
And he annihilates Horner.
Yes,
I'm a Jack Horner fan. I interviewed Jack Horner for the print, the written Dan Schneider interviews. But he destroys Horner in that debate. I mean, it's just.
The most devastating moment is when he takes that bone, and it seems like it's two separate examples, and then he unveils it, and it's one thing, and you can't tell the difference between that something that Jack Horner was specifying as a major difference. He also makes some other excellent points and speaks on a side. It's very specific and concise. I will say that I think it could have been raised to greatness with another hour or so. How does it work? How does it work, Dan, where they're speaking at one point, and how does the length work with these interviews? Does it just kind of come and flow, or do they have some people have only certain time limits they can
Well,
process?
there have been people who had to bail out early. There have a couple of interviews where someone drops off after like the third or fourth segment. Um, he he said told me he wasn't even going to watch the interview because he said he didn't, wasn't interested in it. He just had, I mean, yeah, I don't know if I could have stretched him out to an hour or whatnot. Uh, I think it's at about the right amount of time, only 54 minutes. Had it gone to 90 minutes, it wouldn't have been as good on a per minute basis. So it is what it is. He was not someone who is naturally loquacious, I don't think, but because of the questions I asked, he came off, I think, a lot better than he would have if, let's say, he was been interviewed by your typical podcaster talking about, oh, dude, man, what's the coolest dinosaur you ever saw? He wouldn't have come off as well as he does in this interview. He would have still been a good interview, but it wouldn't have been what this interview was.
The next interview is on John Cassavetes. This has Alex Sherman, another fellow. This is the worst guest perhaps that you've ever had. Alex is quite good and makes some excellent points regarding Cassavetes' film, especially on the killing of the Chinese bookie. But the other fellow, like this is one of the least of the interviews. The other fellow doesn't make a single point that is worth listening to.
Yeah.
It is disappointing in that aspect because it could have been better. And there was another fellow too that bailed on it, so it's not as if you could have mitigated this Edwin's thoughts with the third
Yeah.
fellow.
This is an example of where my open mindedness sometimes bites me on the ass because I don't want to always just have everything be academics from college. I want to sometimes, like when I've do shows on TV or pop culture, get people who run blogs to do these interviews because they sometimes will know more and they'll be more open to saying, well, I could be wrong than an academic was. So this was a kid who had some stuff on Cassavetes online at, I think it was Tumblr or one of those kinds of sites. And I asked him to do it. There was another guy, Marshall Fine was the guy's name, who had written a book on Cassavetes. And I forget the particular reason he needed to drop out. So it basically just became Alex and me sort of giving Alex the keys to the car to talk. And Edwin is going, yeah, man, I didn't think of that. And
Exactly. It's a horror show of an interview on his part.
yeah,
There's not a moment that he has in there, and it is your worst guess.
I think Jessica showed me on the EBIT thread they follow these interviews, especially on films, and most of them are like, they came up with some term. I forget the term that they came up with, talking about Edwin. Edwin Nunez, I think, Nunez is his name, and I kind of feel bad for him because he was a nice kid, but he was just out of his element, out of his depth.
Then there's Herman Melville.
Yeah.
This continues a trend that I have personally found quite grating, where a great writer like Herman Melville is more espoused by historians than by real literary critics.
Yeah.
And it's always focused on the biography and very little on what makes Herman Melville, which is the writing, especially Moby Dick. It's not as if there isn't a point or two, but it's usually pushed by you and then given them to receive and do what they will with it. None are really raised to that point. And if they're experts on Herman Melville, why wouldn't they be more educated about the writing? And I find it kind of grating. There's that horrible poem that he wrote, and Herman Melville, for all his greatness as a prosist, was a horrendous poet. He should have never gone into the medium because he didn't have an ear for it, and he couldn't even come up with basic structure. Some of his poems, they might have an interesting premise as a story, but they don't work as poetry whatsoever. And these are just fans of Herman Melville. They're not speaking about him critically. They're not speaking about his failures. He went into poetry because he thought that he was a failure. He didn't have the confidence in himself, just like Hart Crane didn't. And he went into obscurity and poetry because of the critical reception when he should have persisted regardless and kept at it with his writing, and perhaps even surpassed something like Moby Dick.
Yeah, this is one of the things that this is one of the earliest examples of where I have academics, three of them, and they all know their stuff about his history and whatnot, but yet they don't understand really what makes the writing great. And it frustrates me. I was telling Jessica the other day that I wish sometimes I would know someone or interview someone about a writer or about a filmmaker that would understand that person in a way I didn't, at least, if not better than me, at least in a different way that I could then ask questions and it would come off more naturally. You get a sort of stasis here, and these are all good. And so I look at these kinds of interviews where I have two or three people talking about a filmmaker or a poet. The last one I just did was Jeffers, and I look at it in the sense that okay, this is going to be sort of a cradle to grave bio with me interjecting some things here and there that I can try once or twice to draw someone out. But if they leave it on the table, I don't want to do that more than once or twice, because if I do that 8 or 10 times, they're going to look like a boob. So this is one of those things where I you know I can adjust on the fly that I couldn't do, say, in the written interviews. If I had been interviewing, say, Lee Papa for this video interview and he was acting like an asshole, I could have easily just sort of, tightened the screws around his balls and whatnot, and he probably would have bailed on the interview or something like that. Uh, but I mean, this is an excellent interview. I don't think there are any things like that. These are better than these lectures that you get when you see Birmingham University presents an evening with Melville, and they have three scholars, and some boob sits there and asks the most obvious questions. I ask better questions, generally speaking, and there are, in each of these interviews, 3 or 4 moments where you're getting something you're not going to get from anyone else but me.
It's sort of a mix of all the best interviews too, because William F. Buckley had politics, Dick Cavett had his entertainment, David Susskind had more sustained, longer interviews, and then what's his name? The other guy, he started wearing dresses later in his life. I can't remember what his name is.
John I don't know. Oh, Phil Donahue. Phil Donahue.
Yes, that's right.
He didn't wear dresses. He did it on one show.
They're like your interviews are kind of like a mix of them. They're more broad, so you'll have political topics and then based on art. And don't get me wrong, this is a very good interview, and it has 3 or 4 moments of excellent distillation of story. And it's just grating to constantly see this, and it's a strain throughout all of the interviews with these panel shows on artists to constantly be referring to their life, which has nothing to do with their writing. And it is quite frustrating. It's something that you mentioned NPR does quite often, where they'll be talking about, let's say that he writes a book on pedophilia or something, and the show becomes about pedophilia rather than about the writing of pedophilia. It's one of those things. They have inclination to they have no idea about hierarchy. They don't rate things, even though that's the general thing to do in writing, so you can get to the essence of it.
Yeah.
The next interview after that, let us see.
That's Humphrey Bogart.
Is Bogart, yes. And I thought that you were quite generous in some of your pauses to Bogart. Bogart was not like let's say Leonardo DiCaprio or Tom Cruise. He had a couple good performances, but he was an extremely limited actor. I think this is, though, a generally terrific interview, though, because Farr knows quite a bit about Bogart. It gets into asides about all sorts of films. What have you experienced with his streaming service? Do you think it's a good service? And
I don't subscribe to it. Jessica follows him on Facebook and whatnot. She likes some of his posts about stuff. Initially, there was supposed to be a guy who was a biographer, and the guy was a nut job. I forget the guy's name, but he got paranoid and whatnot. And Farr was going to ask if he could go meet the guy at some cafe to talk about the interview, and then if he could go to Farr's home to do the interview. And the guy was just a nut job. I forget his name, but he was just insane. And so it just ended up, instead of being two or three people, it ended up with just John Farr. That's why I call it Bogart by far, since he's the only person interviewed. But yeah, he gave a good interview, and he gave a lot of the background and whatnot. This or this was, I think, the last interview that I did with just with Super Tintin. Then I think I switched over to Evea for the next 5 or 6 interviews before I got Lightcam. So I mean, this was a good, solid interview. You get a good background, but it's one of the lesser ones, I think, overall.
You think it's one of the lesser ones? I think that it
Compared
is
to
a good interview overall. It certainly not doesn't hit any of the lows that, say, the John Cassavetes one had. It has.
Yeah.
He is so passionate about Bogart and everything that you have to give him credit at least for that. I don't think he gets the ins and out. I don't think he realizes what a limited actor Bogart really was.
Yeah.
It's similar to fans of John Wayne, where they'll talk more about his icon status than anything to do with his acting. You have a later show with James Cagney. Every film that those two shared together, you're looking at James Cagney and what he's doing, and Bogart is just like a background player.
It reminds me of on that Ebert thread where actually the actual thing that Ebert posted, where I'm talking about a scene with Ingrid Bergman and his answers to, trying to be funny. Ebert put up a photo of Ingrid Bergman, and how supposedly beautiful she was. Well, people that fall back on those kinds of tropes, they'll say, "Oh, but wasn't Wayne so dynamic in that?" Okay, what made John Wayne dynamic in that role? That he wasn't the
Have
stiff.
you seen The Conqueror, Dan?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of a Plan 9 from Outer Space kind of level abomination in terms of the acting.
Yeah.
I would recommend people watch it simply if they want to have endless laughs.
He's even bad in the film that he often gets praised for, the Quiet Man, where he's supposed to be Irish. He just can't pull off the Irish stuff. John Wayne. Bogart was, in a sense, just as limited as John Wayne. I think he overall made some better film choices, though.
Yeah, he may have had a type, but at least he knew sometimes how to maximize that type. Yeah. It's just very telling when you see him with James Cagney how much better an actor James Cagney was as compared to Bogart.
Yeah.
Then there's Sarah Joy and Kate Langner. Sarah Joy I discovered years ago. She was doing a song version of who we mentioned before, Neil Hester's poems. Terrific singer, has real talent with arranging music too. I think that their shyness kind of detracts from the ability to get this across as a really good interview. But it's a good portrait. It's not like one of these wacky interviews you'll see later where it only succeeds just to show what a psychotic they are. It's more to do with the fact that they're shy and they don't really want to expound on too much. One of the most bizarre things in it is her friend there. You were speaking about influences, and you think more like Melissa Etheridge or Janis Joplin, someone like that, and she says Beyonce, and you think, what the fuck, what kind of connection is that? Whereas Sarah Joy has way more insight into who she is as a singer and an artist.
Yeah, the girl Kate was very shy. I think Sarah is actually her greatest talent is as an arranger of music and probably a writer of music. Even her original stuff does that. Kate has an interesting way, but Kate, I think I say in the interview, is more the standard coffee shop babe with a guitar, whereas Sarah has a wider spectrum.
That collaboration with Neil Hester shows you how far above even very good poetry is from traditional song lyrics, because the lyrics are just outstanding as compared to most lyrics that you'll find. Even good song lyrics, they're usually just imagined as if a person's speaking. I agree that her greatest talent is in arranging music, but she has a very lilty, great voice too, and potentially better as she grows older.
She did a reading of one of Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, and I did a video of it because it's a very sexually free poem. But Sarah's, I guess, a born-again Christian, or devout Christian or whatnot.
Yeah,
And
it's more a Disney princess version of, of Gwendolyn Brooks than the sexual connotations required for
but it
that
does
role.
come through with her voice. Her voice sounds like a woman who's wanting to get boned.
So the sports writing interview, this was another one of these panel shows. This introduced me to SB Nation. It's very advisable anyone who is interested in quality writing to go to that site. Also, go to long form. There are some terrific essays you can find on there as well. This is an example of why it's more important how something is done than what it tells. Because as someone who has very little interest in sports, there are all sorts of pieces from racehorses to corruptible sportsmen that have real character and you can gain metaphor from some of them too. They're good portraits of people and places and things, and I think that people sometimes get drawn just to subjects that interest them. But even if you're not interested, if you are interested in quality writing, you should be going to this site. They speak about it here. I think the later interview on Essayry is a better overall show, but this is quite an excellent intro to that site.
Yeah. There's not really much I can say, but except that why don't we for the because from going on, we don't need to really go through all of the shows in that way because there are shows that like the essay writing site. Unless you have a specific question, you can lump two or three or four of these shows together, and I can talk about the general things of them. I don't think we have to go through like the Men on Soaps one, the film noir.
Yeah, that one I wouldn't know what to do with. I was going to skip.
The Richard Hobby one, the ones that for George Dickinson. I mean, go for the ones like with the other ones. You don't have to do every single one. Go for the bigger ones, the more interesting ones that stuck with you. You know, we can go
Well,
numerically, chronologically, but you know.
I know you want me just to do whatever I want, but I just wanted to honor what you requested, which is to go through all of them. But if you think that's a better way, then certainly.
Yeah, just go for the ones that stick the most. I mean, if you're not,
I have not read Elmer Kelton, so I don't think that's a good one to speak about. But this one is the first visionary fraud interview that you did was on Richard Dawkins. As someone who is engaged in science as well as the arts, this is someone that I find despicable in a lot of ways. He has taken all the potential that he had as a good science writer and communicator and thrown it away to become a professional atheist. Yet you will find throughout these visionary and fraud interviews that they don't stay on topic and they don't talk about it. And what's enraging about this interview is that the guy who has the negative stance on Dawkins loses the debate because he can't stay on topic. He can't. He doesn't get as many good points in as the pro Dawkins guy, and anyone who listens to this may come away thinking more of Dawkins when he is someone who is a complete and utter fraud. You can point it to the evidence and how badly his writing has declined, but also in how bigoted he is. Any religious topic, regardless of its context, is something that Richard Dawkins will hurl upon and give his bigoted views. He's as bad as the racist views that you can espouse in all sorts of things. But the thing that enrages me the most about him is his closed-mindedness, the fact that he can't see past his own ego, and I just want you to speak about Richard Dawkins, the inauguration of Visionary Fraud, and also if you agree with my stance that the pro-Dawkins guy actually won the debate out of the two.
Well, as far as that, I've only done two of them because it's difficult to get people. A lot of these people are mamby-pamby. A lot of these people who write about someone being an idiot don't want to go on camera. They'll write about it, or I did Dawkins first, then I did Kurzweil. My next one was going to be Noam Chomsky, but I couldn't get any of the negative Chomsky people on unless they were right wing people who disliked him for his politics, rather than for his ability, his desire to speak on things he has nothing to do with. I recently wanted to do a visionary of fraud one on Alain de Botton, that pop cultural psychologist idiot that I don't think knows anything. So I contacted three women who wrote negative articles on him. None of them wanted to appear on camera. A guy who is a philosopher who wrote about him as a bad philosopher said he didn't want to do it or whatnot. And they all use this mamby-pamby stuff. It's like, goddamn, stand behind your stuff, criticize someone or whatnot. You're absolutely right. The whatchamacall, the negative Dawkins guy lost the debate, and it wasn't even, I think, particularly close, is because his views on Dawkins were not really because Dawkins has strayed outside of this or that. It's that Dawkins is a bigot or Dawkins is this. He had his own axe to grind against Dawkins, and that's not the fucking point. And it was frustrating. Both of the guys were nice enough guys. They were gentlemanly and whatnot. So I'm not saying in that sense. But goddamn, stick to the topic. It's called visionary or fraud. When I wanted to do the Chomsky one and when I wanted to do the Kurzweil one, the guy who's pro Kurzweil didn't want to do it for a while because it was visionary fraud. I'm saying, what am I supposed to title the series? Okay guy or so guy. All of these people that I've said have been called in print at one point or another a visionary. Other people have called them a fraud. Visionary or fraud. I think
the Kurzweil one went. You gave too much leeway to them. They never stayed on topic through that entire interview.
Yeah, and I because the one guy, the pro guy, was so aggressive and whatnot, I was like, okay, I sometimes like to let people go. The problem was with that guy is he's sort of a Kurzweil cultist, and at least the two Dawkins guys were professional. The anti-Kurzweil guy who's appeared on a couple of shows, he appeared on the Essay Show, and he's going to appear on a show on JFK that I'm going to do in a month or so. He's a nice guy and whatnot.
Norman Ball, is it?
Norman Ball, but in a sense, he was too nice, and he's another one who, in private, gets critical of him, but he doesn't want to fucking put his balls on the line. I don't understand this. It's like I can, if I'm going to rip someone, if I'm going to rip David Foster Wallace, it's not ripping him on a personal level, but people can't get beyond that. I'm not saying David Foster Wallace was a bad writer because he's a bad person or he cheated on his wife or this, that, or the other thing, other things people have claimed. It's because he was a bad fucking writer, and I have pointed out specifically what's wrong. I could have taken the anti-Dawkins point of view, and I even said, talk about, beforehand, and I once or twice in the show I said, well, let's talk about Dawkins, giving up science so that he could go on these lecture tours with the four horsemen of the atheism or something, so that he could make $20,000 or $50,000 a pop. An hour and a half, 2 hours of speaking, and these people get $20,000 or $50,000 to speak. It's absurd. What kind of university would waste that kind of money for this? This is what I talk about academia and fraud. There is nothing that Richard Dawkins could say, even if he was talking about memes or about the selfish gene, the only two things in his career that people will remember him for. Even if he was talking about that, he's not worth $20,000 for 2 hours, $10,000 an hour. There's nothing that he can say that's that important. But and these people, they don't get that, and they shy away from it. So I don't know if I'm ever even going to be able to do another debate, a visionary or fraud debate, unless it's on people who are dead, like an Ayn Rand. Then maybe someone will get to do it. The Chomsky people were scared off that Chomsky is too powerful within academia, and so it's sort of, they're just infected by being these pussies that don't want to talk about things, and it is frustrating. So that's about it.
Film noir was an interesting show. The panelists clearly had passion for it, as you've stated before. This was actually one of the better shows. They speak mostly about minor films, but the whole film noir movement visually was quite a standard setter in Hollywood. I tend to think that the best film noirs, though, like those of what's his name, Turner, and a few others. Wells has probably the best, even though it's not ascribed to his name, the best film noir I've seen, the best pure film noir in The Third Man. But speak a little bit of that. What is your experience with film noir? Do you have a comprehensive view of it like these fellows do, or was it something that you more tangential? Another great film noir that's not exactly a film noir is The Bad Sleep Well by Akira Kurosawa, but that one is so off kilter from film noir that it's not exactly
Well,
a good
film
comparison.
noir, Bad Sleep Well wouldn't be film noir because he doesn't film in a film noir style. It has negative characters, but visually, the cinematic aspect, film noir is more about how something is filmed and the kinds of characters. The characters who are at the heart uh, for example, the Mifune character is a good guy. He does some bad things, but he's not. He's definitely the hero of the film. In film noir, the putative hero is really an anti-hero in that we don't know whether he's good or bad. So
And
I would,
there's also color film noirs in Chinatown and LA Confidential, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the conventional black and white thing. It's
well, yeah,
often some.
but it's the use of shadow and it's the way black and white is used. Just because a film is black and white and has gangsters in it, you know, the early Cagney films, most of the gangster films, the Warner Brother films of the '30s, were not film noir. They weren't filming it in that kind of a style.
I assume that Caravaggio's look, in a way, is film noirish. Just the mix of shadow with the other characters, and they're usually gray characters too. The Mifune character in The Bad Sleep Well is film noirish in the sense that, and I wouldn't agree that he's a good guy. I mean, he's in many ways as evil as the people that he's trying to usurp, but he they're all despicable, just like in L.A. Confidential, where the Guy Pearce character, who you think is in some ways moral, it turns out to be just as bad as any of them. Uh, they talk about mostly the minor films too. This is again another show, and I would agree that this was a better show than say the Melville one in some ways, just because it's of a lower subject. They don't seem to be able to distinguish the really high quality film noirs, and often great film noirs are ones that kind of go off tangents of it. They conform to the style, but what they say and how they say it is more important than the style itself. The style is only the surface, and while it may be beautifully rendered, if there's no depths beneath the surface, then it falls apart.
Yeah, and that's everyone seems to have their hobby horse, their things that they harp on. And these people, you know, they like film noir. It was something important to them for one reason or another. But it shows the difficulty of trying to get someone who's a quote unquote expert that can step outside of themselves. This is one of the things that that is very difficult with interviewing is to get someone who's able to get outside of themselves and explain why they like or dislike something, which in their rationale means good or bad. I always try to use the terms good or bad, but most people will talk inevitably about, well, I like this poem, I like this film, I live a, you know, I've beaten that to death. There's really not much more to say on that. Um, I will say the next one you should talk about is number 19 with John
Yes,
Shelby Spong, because that was
this is the one with John Shelby Spong is the best single person interview out of the whole series, at least thus far, and probably at the moment. It has, and we were speaking about Richard Dawkins before. There's an aside where John Shelby Spong is talking about Christopher Hitchens, another supposed visionary who's really a fraud. But he speaks about Christopher Hitchens, and they were at a debate function, and Christopher Hitchens gets wind of John Shelby Spong, and he hears what he says, and because he doesn't conform to the stereotype of the Christian theologian, he immediately doesn't want to interview him because he knows he'll lose the debate because John Shelby Spong is so loquacious and passionate and full of ideas that are not just conforming to theologians. They're deep thoughts on existence, and this is one of the more surprising interviews because on the surface it seems like he wouldn't make a good interview, these theologians, but he talks about so many things and he uses God more as a metaphor for the universe than anything to do with Bible studies.
Yeah, and this is the first of my trilogy series, the Existence trilogy. What I did was I wanted to have a theologian, a philosopher, and a scientist talking about a big issue, in this case, existence. And I came I came across. I think he was the first choice I had for theologian. I had heard and seen him on a few videos and whatnot, and the idea of having a passionate pro-Christian guy rather than the typical fundamentalist right-wing nut was interesting. I remember he kept rocking back and forth, and sometimes his face goes out of camera, or you can see up his nostrils or whatnot, because he's in his 80s, so I guess he doesn't know where the camera is or has no idea about it. But yeah, it's a good. I don't know if it's the best one-on-one interview that I did. There are some other interviews that I think are just as good. The comic book guy, for example, even though it's a less weighty subject, he gave a brilliant interview. The Genghis Khan guy and the Spengler guys give performance art almost. They are just interviews on a different plane in a sense. But this is without a doubt one of the great one-on-one interviews.
I would put it slightly above those simply because of the weightiness of the subject and the fact that it is also a surprise out of it's kind of like out of nowhere interview. You would never expect this to be of the great caliber that it is. Anyway, we should move on to another titan, Eugene O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill is likely the best published playwright going. I mean, if you go to Ingmar Bergman for film and consider him a playwright, I would put Bergman above O'Neill, but if I do, very slightly. The interview is another one of these, like not to harp on this on and on and on, but where it is containedly more about the biography than the plays themselves. The most interesting comments are ones by you where you're speaking about how Eugene O'Neill would take things from the Greeks and make them far better and more modern. And he was someone. One of the things that we should talk about. I don't want to harp on what we've been speaking about, how these academics make it all historical information rather than art. So one of the things that they mention is that some of his plays are unfilmable. And I spoke about this with Alex Sherman in terms of if we were ever to go to plays or you were to go over to plays, it doesn't have to be filmable or stageable or what have you. It's a play is exactly what its name implies. It's just it doesn't need to require only dialogue. It doesn't have to conform to any standard. And Eugene O'Neill was so ahead of the curve that way, where he was making these almost introspective dialogues and really getting into the meat of not just the individual characters, but also the stager, the playwright himself, whoever that assumes to be. It's very metaphysical in a way, some of his stuff. Talk about that. Talk about how ahead of the curve Eugene O'Neill, and also the interviews themselves, and whatever you may think of value they've stated.
Well, I want to talk about O'Neill, Kubrick, and the Serling interviews together because that's a run of 3 straight interviews where arguably
brilliant interviews.
Where I arguably have the 3 people in American history who are the tops at their game at that time. You have O'Neill, who's probably the top stage playwright, and I would have to disagree. I don't think I would put Bergman above O'Neill. O'Neill came first. O'Neill was, if you look at you can't really compare screenplay to stage play because there are the added elements of the visual and music that a stage play doesn't have to have, and those kinds of directions and whatnot. But Kubrick, who's arguably the greatest American filmmaker, you can go back and forth with him and Wells. And then Serling, who is probably the greatest television screenwriter in the history of American television. The O'Neill one, I mean, like I said, O'Neill, in a sense, did so much, and he's so all across the board in a good sense with his stage plays that there's really no doubt that modern American theater begins with O'Neill. Again, there were 3, experts. There are 2 women, and it's interesting. because up until that point, it was very, and it's still very difficult to get women on these interviews as experts because they goddamn self segregate. I'm studying lesbian left-handed cinema in Western Canada. Do you want to do a show on left-handed lesbian Western Canadian cinema? I'm your gal. I'm like, no, I want to talk about movies. Oh well, and then a lot of these people too, a lot of the academics, I'm going on a 3 week trip to Florence. Let me get back to you on that. Well, I'm taking the summer off. Well, I'm getting a project, and one of the things that I get emails that really annoys me is when they say, "Oh, I'd love to help you with your project." You know, a single show. It's not a single show. It's not a project. It's fucking 90 minutes or 120 minutes. I'm not going to have time for this. I'm starting a book in 3 weeks. It's like, so you don't have 90 minutes to talk about something. Another thing that I get with some of these people is, I'll say, "Oh, I'm contacting you because you wrote a book about this subject. Maybe a book about O'Neill or about Kubrick or whatnot." They'll say, "Oh, well, I wrote that book back in '03. I haven't really watched Kubrick much since then. I don't know what I could add." You wrote a whole fucking book. I'm not asking you to go into detail. Just talk about the book and what the filmmaker made. These people have these fucking ideas that I'm asking them to give them a goddamn lecture. No, just talk like you would, like a normal person about it. You wrote a book. You're going to know more about the subject, at least in a historic sense, if not a critical sense, than most other people. But they don't want to do that. The Stanley Kubrick interview, getting back to O'Neill, the O'Neill interview had these two gals, and they went. I went through about a dozen people to ask them to do this show, and I ended up with these three, and it's a very good interview. There's Kubrick one. I ended up with just two guys. There's the one guy who's really good, and then there's this young guy who's got this site, Must See Films, but he's whispering through most of the
Yeah,
interview.
exactly.
And
You
it's
can't
like
hear what his thoughts are.
I 3 or 4 times on camera I said, "Could you speak up a little bit, Darren?" And he wouldn't speak up. Darren Foley was his name. He knew a lot. Don't get me wrong. He wasn't like the fellow in Cassavetes. He wasn't an Edwin, but he was just whispering. It's like, come on, a little bit more. The Serling show was.
He seems to have a passion for it too, but it's just the vocal. It's kind of horrendous. It is the big detractor there, but the content of the Kubrick one, I think, is one of the better ones in terms of how much they get Kubrick. Kubrick seems to be one of those people either people completely don't get, or the few experts that know about Kubrick really get, because he at his best he was so ahead of the other American directors.
Now the Serling one, I contacted the daughter and I contacted some people independent of her, Anne Serling, and I couldn't get anyone outside of her. So she recommended these two fellows who appeared with her, both of them named Mark Olshaker and Mark something or other, and they did very well. But the interesting thing was, Anne Serling was the least interesting of the three.
Yes.
And the thing was, she's a very nice woman, lovely person. I nothing against her, but there were several times she started tearing up, talking about her father who died 40 years ago, and I'm like, holy cow! I mean, you got to get over it at some point, but she made a couple of points about him biographically, but the other two guys were very good talking about Serling. I made the good point too that this is me feeding a good example of me feeding people something that isn't necessarily in the public conscious that much. Is later on I did it with the third man talking about Orson Welles' directorial influence on it, but here I talk about how Serling has constantly been derided as having his original screenplay for the Planet of the Apes. The producers say, "Oh no, we didn't take much from him," but I'm like, get out of here, get the fuck out of here. I mean, there are 8, 10, 12 major moments in that film that are direct Serling. I don't give a shit how many script doctors you got. They're Serling, and that gave them a good in to talk for 5 or 10 minutes about that. Um, so that was a very very good interview too.
A few points about all three of them. The Eugene O'Neill one, they fall into the standard of taking long days' journey to the night as his greatest work, when The Iceman Cometh is probably a notch above. With the Kubrick one, I do think they make a few good points, especially when they describe the ending of Doctor Strangelove as having a double ending, where there's the visual of the atom bombs going off to that Vera Ling song, as well as what comes after and the ambiguity of that. The Ron Serling one, I would have been more interested in, what they think of him as a teleplay writer too, because his teleplays were even better than the Twilight Zone stuff, at least as written. Probably
Yeah.
not visually. What do you also think of? Just as an aside, what do you think are some of the best Twilight Zone teleplays, and what do you think are his best teleplays? Period.
I don't remember all the names of the Twilight Zone ones. I can't get into that.
I would
Certainly,
put
some of
Walking Distance and Five Characters in Search of an Exit
yeah,
as the best.
they're both up there. The one he tended to repeat himself in the last couple of years, doing sort of lesser iterations of the stuff. Um, the one To Serve Man was based on an interesting story, and it's kind of funny, humorous. The one there's an early there's a number of ones where time bends or something. When he's at his worst when he's preachy. For example, there's the one where an American soldier is on Guadalcanal or somewhere, and he then morphs to become a Japanese soldier, and it gets a little obvious and preachy. The ones that are less obvious and preachy to me are the best ones. Uh, uh, he did a couple with Mickey Rooney, um, and I could the one with Mickey Rooney is a jockey who supposedly gets bigger and bigger inside his room, and he can't be a jockey anymore. That wasn't good. The I'm trying to think of some of the ones. Uh, there's the famous one with William Shatner on with the Gremlin on the airplane. But I actually think a more interesting one is the one where Shatner plays a guy who's pulling out fortune cards from.
Yes.
He's putting a nickel into a little clown face fortune card thing, and there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing supernatural in that one. It's a great 30-minute piece on addiction though, because nothing supernatural happens in that. It's just about this guy having an addiction, and I don't know if Serling wrote that one, but that's a real good one. There's the famous one about the Howling Man with the devil being locked up, and the guy who unleashed him in the late 30s and now has captured the devil again. Uh, uh, but those are a little bit over the top. There's another famous one about the UFO with the little astronauts that turn out to be Earthlings. But some of them are ruined by some of the bad special effects. That one was not as effective as it could have been, because in no way do those little robotic little spacemen look even remotely human in the way they move, the way we saw Neil Armstrong move just a few years later. Um, so
That's why I posit Walking Distance is perhaps the best, at least of just a single character, because the visuals are so well done too, and the performance by Gig Young, that's a great performance.
another good one, another good
great.
one is the guy who's an advertising executive, but he wants to go to Willoughby, and it turns out Willoughby turns out to be the name of the hearse or
Yes,
the funeral home.
that's a great twist.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen Carol for Another Christmas?
Is that the one with Art Carney?
It's not with Art Carney. It's with Sterling Hayden. This is a different one. This is outside of the Twilight Zone. It's a telefilm he did in 1964, and he did it for the United Nations. Now it's a version of the Christmas Carol. I'm not sure if you'd be able to access it because it's so rare, but I seen it on one of these stations, and it has some of the worst of Rod Serling, but also some of the best. And I actually think the ending where the de facto Scrooge, played by Sterling Hayden, is a better ending than any of the other Christmas Carol iterations because he changes a little bit, but not that much.
Hmm.
Whereas the Christmas Carol ending, I've always found very schmaltzy and silly and not realistic in the least.
Okay. Yeah. As far as the actual teleplays, the most famous ones are Patterns, which made his name, and then Requiem for Heavyweight. I have to look at. I know that I've seen those two on a PBS series that I later got the DVD for, and I think they have a third one of his on that DVD. It's the one with Mickey Rooney, I think, where Mickey Rooney is an asshole Ernie Kovacs type 1950s television star who abuses people. I know that I had seen in the 1970s, before PBS did this series uh, on Golden Age television, which I have the DVD for. I do remember New York Public Television did rebroadcast some of the kinescopes for some of the Playhouse 90s. And there probably was some Serlings there. Unfortunately, they haven't, as far as I know, none of the screenplays or none of the teleplays have been published in publication form. They should be. Hopefully, Serling's daughter will get on that because she's got a publishing company. I think that's a valuable thing they could do. One thing that I did kind of feel a little bit was silly was when their publishing company wants to publish only stories that are in that Rod Serling twist kind of ending with his kind of viewpoint. I just never have understood why any publishers want to just publish only one type of thing, one type of viewpoint, one type of story or whatnot. But other than that, those three were very good.